As you might be aware, we are shifting into a new sermon series through Pentecost, which is the liturgical season we find ourselves in. This Easter season runs right up into Pentecost in May, and the title that we have given to this series is called Ordinary Joy in Extraordinary Times. And I have to be honest with you, the idea of talking about joy at a time like we're in, to feel joy, it's a question. Why would we discuss something like this? Why would we talk about something in the middle of a pandemic where the global body count continues to mount, and where I think as of yesterday or earlier on Thursday, about 25 million new people had filed for unemployment in the United States. So the effects of this pandemic will be rippling out in various ways, whether it's physically or psychologically or financially. And sadly, we're also realizing that the people that are most affected by and bearing the brunt of both the sickness and also the economic costs tend to be our lower income workers and a disproportionate amount of Black and brown people in our country. And so there's all sorts of reasons why not to be joyful. There's all sorts of reasons to be frustrated and fearful and even angry in this time, certainly confused. And so how do we talk about joy? It's a good question. In fact, we thought about scrapping this entire sermon series a few weeks ago. We were thinking about what's coming up, and we had planned with the seasonal leadership team back in the fall to do a series on joy and happiness. We thought it'd be a great thing to do in the spring, following a series talking about the earth and our care for the earth and how we've got a long ways to go in caring for this earth of ours that is crying out. So we thought a good series on joy and happiness would be appropriate. And then the closer we got, we thought, well, maybe this isn't appropriate at all. And we thought about just scrapping it and coming up with something else. But as I began to kind of ask some of you and talk to some of you and do some reading and some research and thinking about joy and kind of plumbing the depths of my own soul, because to be honest with you, this has not been an easy time for me. There have been struggles, some days with anxiety or depression that I haven't dealt with for years. And there's something about being in the midst of this and the change and the scheduling and the not being able to be with people who are mourning, or not being able to be a part of memorial services, or knowing that different things are having to be postponed or canceled altogether and plans being shifted. It's hard stuff we're in the middle of, and some days are harder than others. And so at a larger level and at a personal level, we thought about calling off this sermon series. But as I had already begun to kind of think about it and talk about it with other people and read some things, one of the things that stuck out to me was that the people who had the most kind of profound revelations and understandings and experiences of joy were, whether it was people from today or people from 100 years ago or 200 years ago or biblical writers, the people that wrote with the most profound and deep understanding of joy that really seemed to resonate are the people that weren't writing in the midst of times that were normal or were easy. They were people who were penning their thoughts, sharing their thoughts and their experiences in the midst of darkness and of loss, whether that be as recipients of racism or in the middle of a war, or dealing with death or mental illness. It's been in those times, kind of when it's darkest, that if you can find that light, that one light in the darkness, it has more of a profound effect, and you can talk about joy in a way that you can't, that might seem a little bit flippant or kind of rose-colored glasses if you're talking about it in another time. So I began to realize that no, actually, maybe this is the time to talk about joy. And for those of us who have thought about joy in one way or another, to perhaps get to a different level, a different understanding of what joy is all about as followers of Christ, as Christians. So I think this is important. This is an important topic for us to talk about. But before we dive into it, I want to just come up with some agreements, right? Things that we're talking about and we're not talking about when we get into joy, because some people can say, I don't want to talk about that or whatever. But let's just make some agreements together. So I've got a few things that I would love to just share with you, and I am going to share my screen. And I am not nearly as good at this as Alex is, so please forgive me if I mess up. Hopefully you are seeing my screen. Here we go, baby. So what we're not, let's just agree that we're not talking about, when we talk about joy, we're not talking about the power of positive thinking. That's not what we're doing here. In fact, there's been plenty of studies that show that just doing that and denying difficult feelings and just thinking positively can actually have negative effects on us psychologically long term. So we're not talking about that. That's not what this series is about. We're also not saying that or denying the difficulties and the pains of life. In different places, in different times, people are dealing with deep tragedies and pain, right? And so we're not denying the difficulty of personal circumstances where people are and what trauma they're dealing with in whatever shape, all right? So that we acknowledge that everybody's there. We're also not saying that everybody is the same and that we're all starting from the same point and we can move on from there and grow joy. Some of us, to put it in cartoonish characters, some of us are just more wired to be a Tigger, and some of us are more wired to be an Eeyore. And there's actually online tests that can tell you what percentage of Tigger or Eeyore that you are, and that's okay. We need Eeyores, we need Tiggers, and so we all come from different places, and we acknowledge that just from a basic kind of wiring level, we're at different places. So we're not saying that we're all the same. What we are saying, and what I want us to agree with here, is that joy is not, we're not talking about a feeling, something that we just kind of a privilege that we just all deserve, that should just be there, we should feel joyful. We're not talking about that. That might be a result of this deeper joy, Christian joy, that we're going to be talking about, but we're not talking about just a feeling. And it's helpful maybe to get there if we think about the etymology of this word, which was an interesting thing for me to do last week. So if you get to the etymology of this word joy, it comes from the Middle English word joy. That's what it translates directly into our modern English. Comes from the Old French word joie, right? And then that comes from the Latin gaudium or gaudere, and that means to be glad or to rejoice, right? So what we're talking about is an action, is a discipline, and that actually the emotion, the feeling of joy comes as a result of or a response to or in coordination with rejoicing, right? So finding ways to rejoice even in the darkness is a way to grab a hold of joy. And we as Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ, the God who died alone on the cross, are ones who can find in the midst of that faith, even in the midst of difficult times, ways and reasons to rejoice, which leads to an experience of joy. So that's, we're talking about action. And then finally, the last thing that I want us to agree on is that we believe, and we would agree, hopefully, that it does not mean to be a good Christian, and some of this just kind of sneaks into those of us especially who come from maybe more of a Midwestern Calvinist tradition of faith. To be a good Christian, you do not have to look like this, okay? That's not what it means, right? So sometimes we think as a good Christian, you're not even supposed to maybe feel happy, or you don't have a right to be happy. Your joy isn't something that we talk about. We talk about hard work. We talk about denying the flesh. We talk about maybe memorizing Bible scriptures. We talk about praying every day. We talk about being selfless, which is all great stuff. But it doesn't mean that we also shouldn't be practicing the discipline of joy and happiness. So I just want us to agree on those things before we go any further. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a second. So the other thing that I wanted to remind us as we go into this joy series on joy in extraordinary times is that we are still in Easter season, right? So I'm sitting here still next to the cross. I've got my Easter stole on that some folks in the choir made for me. This Easter season, especially early on in the Easter season and in our Bible story, we're typically at this time of the year preaching from the very early experiences of Easter in the lives of the disciples. And one of those stories that is typically read right after Easter is the story it's called The Road to Emmaus. And in just a little bit, Joshua Coney is going to read part of that for us, but actually not the part that we typically read, right? The typical story of the road to Emmaus is told this time of year, and it's a story of a man and a woman who are walking on a long, dusty road away from Jerusalem. They're walking to a little town, sleepy town called Emmaus, their hometown, because they had been in Jerusalem during the passionate final week of Christ's life and then his death. They, along with the other disciples, had an understanding of what was going to happen and what their lives were going to be like, and the success and all the good things that were going to take place as a result of Christ taking his role of leadership in Jerusalem and what that kingdom would look like. And all of that came crashing down. And so they are headed back, walking back, these two, to this sleepy town called Emmaus. And their friend had been arrested and tortured and killed. His followers had all been scattered. They had lost their callings, their careers, whatever it was, and they're on their way home. One song that came to mind as I was thinking about this was a Talking Heads song, "We're on the road to nowhere." And sometimes it feels like that way. We're on the road to nowhere, right? And we don't know exactly how we got on that road. We don't know exactly where we're going. And it can be long, it can be dusty. We can be sitting there talking with others on this road about how things didn't work out the way we thought they were going to, about how our life plans just kind of fell apart. And when we're on that road to nowhere, the conversations that ensue, the things that happen there, even in the midst of that sadness and that mourning and being on a road that you didn't intend to be on, if we pay attention, sometimes we can be surprised by the presence of joy even there. So that is the context. These are the disciples who are on their way to Emmaus. Jesus shows up and begins to walk with them on that road as they are turning in to their home. They notice that this man, but at the time, I'm sorry, I should have said this, they don't know it's Jesus at the time. There's just this guy, and they're kind of bitching and moaning a little bit about how badly things had turned out, and this stranger's just listening to them and kind of talking to them. And then as they get home, the stranger's going to move on and keep walking, and they say, no, come and break bread with us, come eat with us. And so the stranger comes in, and they continue their conversation around the dinner table, and as they're breaking bread, all of a sudden, these disciples realized this stranger on the road was Jesus Christ, was the resurrected Christ. And they are filled with joy. They freak out. And it's at that point that our reading begins for today. Luke chapter 24, read by Joshua Coney. Thank you, Joshua.
All right. Verse 33. They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord really has arisen. He appeared to Simon." Then the two disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread. While they were saying these things, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were terrified and afraid. They thought they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you startled? Why are doubts arising in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. It's really me. Touch me and see. For a ghost doesn't have flesh and bones like you see I have." As he said this, he showed them his hands and feet. Because they were wondering and questioning in the midst of their happiness, joy, he said to them, "Do you have anything to eat?" They gave him a piece of baked fish. Taking it, he ate it in front of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. So friends, what I love about this passage is that that these disciples were thinking life was going to go one way, right? They were in Jerusalem for Passover, and who knows, they could have been seated around that dinner table with Jesus, that final supper with him and his disciples, and they had this notion of what was going to happen and how Jesus was going to rise up and take on some sort of civic power, and that they would be a part of that, and it didn't work out, right? And so they're talking about that and this long ride home on this road to nowhere. And then Jesus walks next to them. And even in the course of their walking with him, they get a sense that this guy is a little different. Something special is happening. They don't put two and two together quite yet. And finally, when the realization of the resurrection, that Jesus Christ himself was with them, right? Their goosebumps kind of take over, and they get this rush, and they recognize who it is that they've been talking to. They don't just sit there around the table then and chat about it. They don't say, wow, that was pretty cool. What movie do you want to watch tonight, right? They didn't just kind of move on to the next thing. They talked about it, and not just talked about it, they stood up, and it was already dark, right? But they got up and they headed back to Jerusalem that night, right? I don't know if they ran or what they did, but it was not a short trip, somewhere around 4 or 5 miles. They did something with that experience of joy, that epiphany, that resurrection, that miracle that they experienced. They did something with it. They acted on it. They headed back to Jerusalem, right? And even though, it's late, they get there, they find the other disciples, and they begin to explain to them, right? They begin to describe to them what had happened and who this person that they met along the road and the feelings that they had. And then he started breaking bread, and these things took place, and they're telling the story. They're retelling the story to the disciples, and it says that Jesus showed up again. And this kind of hit me as I read the text this time. I think there's something in this, right? So I want just a little thought experiment. Here's a question. If these two disciples, this man and woman who had experienced Christ in Emmaus, if they hadn't gotten up and run back to Jerusalem and told their story, retold their story in detail, would Jesus have showed up there? Was there something about their act of faith and response, of rejoicing and going back and telling others and sharing that good news with others, that was a part of Christ then showing up there as well? You hear what I'm saying? So I want to do this real quick again. I'm gonna share my screen, and I want to just look at this passage again with you real quickly. Let's see. I'll make sure I'm in the right place. Here we go. So let's see. I want to go back. Okay. Here's the disciples. I'm going to draw on my screen here. Let's see if I can do it right. So they got up, right? As soon as they figured out what had happened, they did something, right? They got up right then, and they returned to Jerusalem, right? A place that they didn't think things had turned out the way they wanted to. And so as they returned, they were changed people. I mean, we can kind of think about how it is that we will return to work or will return to normal, but are there ways that we can be returning with a deeper understanding of joy? So they find the 11 disciples and their companions gathered together, and they said to each other, the Lord has really appeared to Simon. And the disciples explained what happened along the road, right? So they went into detail how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. And while they were saying these things, Jesus himself stood among them. Like there's something to that, right? And it says that they were, right? They were terrified and afraid. One of the things we have to recognize is that just because we feel terrified, just because we're afraid, just because we're confused, doesn't mean we can't also experience joy, right? They're not opposing forces. Then Jesus says, why are you startled? Why are doubts arising in your head? Look at my hands and feet. Touch me, right? So do something else here. Touch me, see. He showed him his hands and his feet. And it says, because they were wondering, right? So they still were questioning, and yet they were still terrified and afraid. they knew happiness and joy. I think there's something to that. In the midst of what can be painful, terrifying, scary, confusing, if we can recognize those things, even those little things in our lives that are miraculous. And I heard one gentleman say in one of the podcasts I was listening to that he made a decision after going through a very difficult time in his life to keep a journal, and every day he was just going to write a short essay on something that was miraculous, something for which he was thankful and brought him joy. He said just the practice of having to think about that every day, just noticing a flower, noticing the way another person moved their hands when they talked. And he said that thing, that flower, that bird song, that person gesturing, that smell in the air, it wasn't miraculous until I said it was miraculous. And once I learned to start calling things miraculous or beautiful, then they became that. So there's agency, there's power within us simply in recognizing that odd feeling, that thing that's happening around us, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and saying, wait a minute, something amazing is happening here, and I need to speak it out loud. I need to share it with others. I need to rejoice. And in that rejoicing and that retelling and that sharing, Christ shows up again. So let me kind of move on from that. The thing that also is challenging about talking about joy and happiness is that the thing that is probably the biggest impediment to our experiencing of joy and happiness is us. So circumstances, certainly, and especially in dire and very, very severe, violent circumstances, that it can steal our joy. But a lot of what steals our joy or keeps us from experiencing joy is us, right? It's our habits or our instincts. The Apostle Paul says it this way, and the Apostle Paul tends to speak kind of bluntly. But in Romans chapter 7, verse 15, he says this. Tell me if you can't relate. I don't know what I'm doing because I don't do what I want to do. Instead, I do the things that I hate. I don't know what I'm doing because I don't do what I want to do. Instead, I do the things that I hate. As wonderful as we are as humans, and we are beautifully and wonderfully made and complex and amazing, sometimes we should not trust our instincts, especially when it comes to what's going to make us happy, right? For some of us, right, more money, for a number of people in the world, more money really truly would change your life and make you more happy, give you access to things that you don't have, that really truly would make you more happy. People who are experiencing food deprivation, right? Having a high calorie, fatty meal really will make them happier. But for most of us have enough of that basic stuff, right? We have what we need. We're okay. Most of us are. And when we're feeling down, when life is feeling heavy and we need a lift, what do? What do our instincts tell us to do, right? Well, if you're like me, you grab a handful of M&Ms, and then you grab another handful of M&Ms, because that's just going to make me happy. And then if that doesn't work, you scroll through a bunch of TV shows, or you flip through your smartphone and compare yourself to other people. You either start to feel a little bit envious of things that people have that you don't have, or you start to feel better about yourself because there are clearly people who are in way worse cases or are losers in ways that I'm not, right? So there's certain things that we will do, that we will turn to, that we think will make us happy, right? Binge watch another series, engage in that habit that maybe fulfills us for just a moment, but then actually leaves us feeling more unfulfilled. And I want to tell you this, I'm not knocking any of that stuff, right? In certain doses, when you've had a tough day, taking the edge off, doing something that helps you just to kind of pause for a moment is important, and I think that's okay, and it plays a role in our lives. But the thing that I think we have done is that we have cheapened joy a little bit, and so doing that over and over again, we've put the bar too low, right? That what we do when we need to feel joy or experience joy is we just kind of go for a quick dopamine rush or a fantasy or a sugar high, and we think that somehow that is what should bring us happiness, but that the happiness, the joy that God wants us to experience, it's not that easy. And it takes a little bit more work, and the bar is set a little bit higher, right? We as Americans in 2015 spent $70 billion in lottery tickets. More than we've spent on books, entertainment. The thing is that this narrative of what's going to bring us joy, what's going to make us happy, has actually, we're kind of losing that. We're losing that fight. The people that have got the loudest bullhorns and that are convincing us as to what will make us happy, what truly will make our life fulfilling, is not necessarily coming from the deep wisdom of those who have walked through darkness and have shared in places like Scripture and other places that deeper understanding of joy. That the folks that are winning are the people that have got the airwaves and have got the social media channels and are convincing us again and again what it is that will bring us joy. I wanted to share it with you one last slide. That's not true. I've got a couple more, but it's this. In 1967, college freshmen were asked, what is very, very important for a meaningful life? Another way to put it was, what will make you joyful in the long run? And in 1967, 43% of college freshmen said that being well off financially was important. 43%, so not even 50%, right? 85% believed that a meaningful philosophy of life was what was most important. Fast forward to 2005, and certainly this trend has continued, so I guess it's higher than this even. 71%, probably 75% today, believe that the thing is really going to lead to an important and meaningful life is being very well off financially, very well off financially. So not just making it, not having enough, but being very well off, that financially off. That is what's going to bring us happiness, and that an understanding of a meaningful philosophy of life is dipped from 85 to 52%. So there's a narrative, there's a story that's winning, and it's the story of quick fixes and simple happiness, sugar highs and dopamine rushes. And we have got, as Christians, we have got the ability to tell a deeper story, to experience a deeper level of rejoicing, and to share that with others so that others can experience a joy, an eternal joy that the world can't provide in the same way. Where I'm getting some of this information, just a quick word of encouragement. If joy is something that we're supposed to practice, what we want to do in this series is find ways that we can practice together, developing this discipline of joy, right? In our Christian circles, we can tend to think that joy, as Christians, we're supposed to kind of look like this, right? We are to be stoic. And when it comes to the disciplines of a good Christian life, we don't think typically beyond quiet time or going to church or reading your Bible, but we need to be thinking about joy and practicing joy, tending to joy, recognizing happiness, rejoicing and sharing that joy. That is a very powerful and important spiritual discipline on a daily basis, that the more we practice it, the better we get at it, and the compounding interest will actually have an effect on our lives so that we experience that eternal joy that God wants us to know, so that we can have life and life to the full, so that we can experience the fruit of the Spirit, right? Love and joy and peace and patience, and that we can then be agents of and bringers of that resurrection, hope, and joy to others as we rejoice and we proclaim. One of the things that I'm doing with my extra time that I would encourage you to join me in, if you'd like to, is I just signed up for a class at Yale. I've never taken a class at Yale before. I didn't get into Yale, but now I'm taking a class on Yale taught by Dr. Laura Santos. If you would like to, there's the link right here, and it's been a wonderful class, and it's the science of happiness, and a lot of it, believe it or not, kicks back to the same truth that we all know in following Christ. The deeper things of joy actually truly lead to happiness. And so if you're looking for something to do and you want to take a class at Yale, and you can say you just got a credential, or you took a class, you can take it for free or pay a little bit and get a credential. But I would encourage you to do that. The thing that we want to be able to develop our habits, spiritual habits that make us into the kind of people that make us into the people who love God and love ourselves and love others, no matter who they are, where they are, with a love that transforms us all. To be people like that, we've got to know that it's going to take work. But that the work of rejoicing and being joyful in the midst of a dark time perhaps is the time when it's needed the most. And so we're going to be encouraging each other during the course of this series to be sharing with each other what we are doing, how we are experiencing that deeper joy that is beyond maybe just a dopamine rush or a simple taking the edge off. And we're going to be sharing with you practices. So if you'd like to join that class, I would encourage you to do that. If there's other things that you've found that you'd like to share with the rest of us, we would love to see that. Every Sunday, we're going to practice a way to tend to joy, to grow in this discipleship. And then every Monday, you're going to get an email out that Kristen or others will send out with a little video clip or another way, a spiritual practice, a spiritual discipline that you can just try to incorporate as an individual or as a family, so that we can be people who build joy and rejoicing as a discipline in our lives, and therefore hopefully become more joyful people who can bring the joy of Christ then to others. And so today we're going to be practicing this thing called savoring. That's what I think the disciples on the road to Emmaus did. They experienced Christ, and they didn't just go then watch a movie. They savored it. They talked about it. They got up. They ran back to Jerusalem. They told the story again, and in so doing, the exponential joy of their experience was realized. And so what we want us to do today is to take some time and to think about, just thinking back over our week, whether it was a tiny thing or a big thing, a subtle thing or a profound thing. Where did we experience a little miracle? Where did we experience something beautiful? And how can we savor that, talk about it, and allow others to be blessed by it and experience resurrection? So that's what we're going to be doing. And I would hope all of you can be a part of that so that we can grow together in our experience of joy, even in the midst of a dark and confusing time that we're in.